We've lived in New Orleans now. Well, now we've lived here for 33 years. So.
And we've lived in Gentilly Terrace for 31 of those 33 years.
Right.
In fact, in the same house for the last 31 years.
Mm-hmm.
And Gentilly Terrace, just for reference, is part of Gentilly. It's the oldest part of Gentilly, which is one of the largest, not neighborhoods, because it's more than a neighborhood, but it's one of the largest identifiable regions of the city. And then in Gentilly itself, there are 24 identifiable neighborhoods.
And Gentilly Terrace is on a clay ridge, so you're actually one of the higher points, and especially this part.
So it's off the Gentilly Ridge. We live about 3 blocks from the top of the Gentilly Ridge, which is like 1 block too far away. If we had been 1 block closer to the top of Gentilly Ridge, we would not have had water in our house.
Okay. Right. So we knew we were on a ridge. We knew we never flood. We watched all of the shots of the city and everything as it was happening. And so yeah, we were close, but not close enough. They said we had maybe 7 feet of water in our street and in a foot and a half in the house. So you could stand in the street and you knew that the water was coming over your head.
So so talking about Katrina, when Katrina hit, I know they had started saying the city needs to evacuate. Where'd you guys go?
Well,
it was different. We weren't together.
We weren't. So if you remember, Katrina was headed toward Florida by all the experts. And so when I got home from work on Friday afternoon, I took a nap, and when I woke up later that night, that was when they were telling people that we had basically 48 hours to get out of the city of New Orleans. So on Saturday, I went to Home Depot and bought plywood, and spent all day Saturday covering the plywood, the windows of our house with plywood. Charlene was in Oklahoma visiting her parents, who she had been gone for about 4 or 5 days.
Mm-hmm.
And so on Sunday morning at 3 o'clock in the morning, I put the dogs in the car and left 1 car here and took a little bag that had basically maybe 2 days worth of clothing and 2 days worth of dog food in it and almost nothing else, and got in the car and drove away, because I didn't think that Katrina would destroy the city. I just thought we'd be back in 4 or 5 days. So Charlene was already in Oklahoma. I drove to my brother's house, and he lived outside of Fort Worth, Texas. And so Charlene came back and forth from Oklahoma for a weekend, and then came down, and we left Fort Worth and went to her
Houston.
sister's house, who lives in Cypress, Texas.
Mm-hmm.
And we were with her for another 2 weeks until
Rita hit.
Hurricane Rita came ashore, and they were evacuating Houston. So we left Houston and evacuated to Canyon Lake, which is up south of Austin, southwest of Austin, and spent 4 or 5 days there, and then went back to their house in Cypress, and then came back to New Orleans. My sister lives in River Ridge, which is up near New Orleans, but not in New Orleans, and it had not had water in it. So we ended up living with my sister for
3 months.
3 months in my niece's bedroom. And then we moved from there to an apartment, a double, over by City Park, which also had not had water in it. And we lived there for 17 months, until we moved back into the house.
So no one was allowed in New Orleans for a month. So Norm was the associate dean there for UNO. So they were still trying to get the university up and running. How are we going to do that? So Norm was still trying to work from afar and kind of chomping at the bit to get back in town. So as soon as they said these neighborhoods are open, then we came on immediately. And so we were some of the very first to to be in, so they were really blocking all of the roads. The police were in. Another friend of mine, Ramona Jordan, she lived in Lakeview, and so we came in with our boots on and kind of circumvented the police a little bit to come back in the back way to try to get to her house there in Lakeview. And so they had roadblocks everywhere. But we were able, I don't think we could even come to our house. Ken Cryer came to our house, and he was able to look in, see in, know that we had flooded. But it was several more days, a week, before we could even get into this part of the neighborhood, because the water was still standing in parts.
So when you were able to get back in, what was the sort of prospectus on being able to do anything at that point in time? Because I'm assuming everybody was in the same sort of situation you were, right?
So when we got back here, we had only about 18 inches of water, as Charlene said. So it's amazing how much stuff you have in the first 18 inches of your house. Way too much stuff. And the water had kind of just moved everything around. It had repositioned furniture and books and all kinds of things had floated around and then just sat wherever the water left them. When we came in, it was all the furniture had been badly damaged, and there was mold all over everything because of my good job of blocking out all the sunlight by putting up the plywood.
And it was dark because all the windows were still barricaded. So when we came in, we kind of like flashlights and some of the light from the front door, but it was just kind of a gray and brown over everything.
So I think that's kind of important that, I mean, because we did this too. Part of what I don't know people understand is sometimes 2-3 times a year in New Orleans you go get the plywood. Some people keep it.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So you went away expecting to be away 4 days because...
That was our history. We'd only actually left the city a couple of times before that. We left the city for Andrew in the early 1990s. We left for Georges, which was in the late 1990s. And we had not really ever left the city other than those 2 times.
No, Ivan.
Ivan.
Where did we spend the night in the car?
Yeah, Ivan, which was in 2004. If you remember, there were dozens of hurricanes in the Gulf in 2004, but none of them came to Louisiana. Ivan was on its way here and then turned and went to Florida, but we evacuated on Ivan, and after 12 hours, we were only about 6 miles from the house, just stuck in gridlock. So we ended up making it across the lake and spent the night in a parking lot at a bank. And then
In the heat with 2 dogs.
In the heat with 2 dogs in the car. It was lovely.
Yeah, so then we found another friend that took us in. So we thought we would, and I was in Tulsa because my mom was ill with Alzheimer's, and I had taken a sabbatical that year. So I was just thinking there was no storm in the Gulf, and I thought I'll just go spend a couple weeks with her and help my dad. So Norm kind of called and said, there's a storm in the Gulf. It's headed for Panama City or something. Don't worry. And less than 24 hours later, he said, what do you want? We're packing up. I can only take so much. And so, get out, take the dogs. Whatever's left is whatever's left.
Yeah. So when you came back, you came into furniture moved around everywhere, mold everywhere, in part because you couldn't get back.
We couldn't get back, so it sat.
And everything was boarded
Right.
up. So Louisiana mold's here to begin with, and it just started growing.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So you also, you mentioned you had photos.
Mm-hmm.
All of the photos we'd ever taken in our adult lives were in boxes or...
Big Rubbermaid containers that weren't fastened underneath our bed.
Right.
Underneath all our beds. So that's
Several
where, right. So, and some were on the bottom shelves of bookshelves.
Right.
So every photo that we owned, if it wasn't hanging on the wall, it was gone. Our wedding album, all of that stuff. So there were some pictures. We saved some. We threw away tons, but we saved some that you can kind of tell that there's an imprint of the image in the center of it, and then the water just kind of took out all of the colors from the rest of the picture. So some we've saved for posterity, some we gave away, most we threw away, and try not to have attachments.
So coming back to all that, you were looking at a long time to get back in your home and be able to live in it.
Mm-hmm.
What were the first decisions you had to make? How did you work through that process?
Well, I thought it was interesting because all of the neighbors, we kind of came back and we're standing on the front lawn in kind of shock. I mean, we're all in our house like, you staying? Are you staying? I don't know. Are you staying? So everyone's kind of wanting to be not the only one that comes back, but also, you know, you want to be there with the support of many. So I think because it's a historic neighborhood, because we didn't have water up to the roof, which just in the next block, the ridge drops off right by our house. So in the next block over, it was 5 feet, 7 feet. And as you got closer and closer to the lake, it was over the top. So we had more salvageable space than many of our friends and much of the city. So that kind of gave us a sense in some ways that the whole house isn't gone, that it looks bad, all of our furnishings are gone, but maybe we can come back. And I think the more people that would say they were coming back, the more that kind of bolstered our intention to do it. It also really, really helped that Norm had a job and I had a job, and many, many people didn't have jobs. So a lot of them, they came back and they said, we're sending this part of the company to Dallas or to Atlanta, or you're just out of a job. But we had the anchor of our jobs. So in some ways it made more sense to stay here when we had employment than to just walk away from it.
Yeah, having jobs really made a difference. That's absolutely the truth. And again, as Charlene said, we were fortunate to live in a neighborhood which was salvageable, whereas a lot of people lived in neighborhoods that weren't. So, excuse me, you have a lot of people where if they were going to return to their home, they were going to be the only house on the block. There was a real threat that you could be the only person, the only house on your block, or maybe only house in 5 blocks. Mm-hmm. So that was a big difference between us and there. Because again, on the other end of the block from where we live, houses did not have water in them. So there was a large section of houses that were inhabitable immediately after the storm. People lived there.
But they couldn't get in because of the barricades.
They couldn't get in until we came in, but then they could start living there immediately. Now their yards were still totally brown. There was still not a living thing anywhere.
Not close to the ridge. They had no water in their yards.
Oh, well, it was kind of like brown, green.
Yeah, green at the top of their yards. So
it was a very weird kind of sensation. That was another very odd thing about coming back here, is everything was dead. It kind of looked like a nuclear holocaust had gone off, and everything was just in kind of ash, and there wasn't a single bird, an ant.
Silence.
Nothing. So the silence of the city was very, very eerie.
And so I'm also kind of curious, did you have like physical plants? Did you have electricity? Did you have sewage? Did you, the things that you sort of take for granted?
We didn't have electricity for
months.
7 months, 6 months. So we didn't live here, so that's okay. We bought a generator, and our people that were working on our house could use the generator to power their tools. And it was certainly fine during the day. And we didn't have running water here for a very long time. We didn't have sewage or gas here for a very long time. And they finally got the water system. The water system, as you will find from talking to people, the water system in New Orleans is very old. So the distribution lines are very old. So right after the storm, when they got the water plant up and running, they were losing 40 million gallons of water a day just due to breakages in the line. So that meant that there were large sections of the city just did not have fresh water. And For some time we had non-potable water. We had water that you could, water the garden with or flush the toilets, but you weren't supposed to drink it. We didn't have electricity for a long time, as I said, and then they replaced, the gas lines were also very, very old, so they had been infiltrated with water. So even if you had gas appliances or gas furnace or whatever, you couldn't use it because the gas had all been turned off while they fixed the gas system as well. That was okay because after Katrina passed, we had a brutally hot fall, and it was hot here until way into December.
Mm-hmm.
So we didn't really need to heat anything, but
It was hot. It was hot. And so not only was that our situation, but that was a situation for everyone. So
also,
there was,
the people at the top of the ridge?
they had no gas. Okay.
they maybe had generators to generate some electricity, but I think they had the same water system that we did, so they, so I think many of them could live in their houses, but it was probably kind of like camping.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They didn't have to go find another place, and that was a huge, huge piece, is that housing shortage was mammoth. So people were, right away were scooping up any house they could find in Baton Rouge and anywhere in the surrounding area because there was nothing. And we had our Norm's sister's brother's family. They had maybe 5 families living in a little 3-bedroom house in Baton Rouge because many of their houses were not destroyed but had issues. And so they were all trying to come in and do work, but there was no place for them to live here. So one of our friends, we felt very fortunate that Norm's sister lived in River Ridge and their house didn't flood. So we had a place to stay, and then we were very fortunate that a friend of ours, Karen Henson, that she and her husband had just moved from uptown to Mid-City and had bought a double, and they were going to rent out the other side, and they had just built it or bought it, so they had nobody living there yet. And so they kind of put out the word, if anyone needs a place to stay, they can stay in the other half of our house. So we called immediately and said, pick me. And that was awesome because that was maybe 7 minutes away. And so not only were they friends, but it was close, and we felt like we weren't struggling to find very expensive housing for a very long period of time.
So, part of it is luck. I think it was because we were lucky enough to find this resource that was so close to our house. That's what really enabled us to rebuild our house. If we had had to have lived in some suburb of New Orleans while we were trying to rebuild our house, we would have no way we have been able to do that in 2 years. It took us 2 years as it was, but it was only because I could come by here all the time on my way home from work or on my way to work, or I could pop down here from work because it was so close. So it really was important.
Now, were you able to get contractors, and how did that all work out? You did a lot of it yourself, as I
We did
remember.
some ourselves. We did kind of by word of mouth, getting contractors. A lot of people, as you can imagine, were really burned badly from getting contractors that would take their money and say, I need half of it down, and then would leave. And different neighbors in the block, they had that situation where they were trying to then sue, but the people were gone. So we got who we thought was a good contractor. I think, from what I hear, that anytime you have anyone that's rebuilding your house, by the time it's over, you probably are not in good speaking terms because there's just issues. So we had issues like everybody else has. And but we kind of got this guy's name from another person who said, oh, he was great, he was wonderful. And he was fine, but they did a lot of things wrong because they couldn't get good help. So your contractor's only as good as his workers are good. And they couldn't find workers. So that's why you have such a huge influx of people from Mexico, because they came and they were gutting houses and they were doing carpentry and roofs and everything. And some of the things that we had done were done okay, and some of them were done horribly. So, our air conditioner was put in backwards, and, they're just things that happened. But for the city, we didn't have the whole city didn't have any power or gas. So there's some photographs that are pretty awesome that you can look at night, looking at the line there at the 17th Street Canal, and you see all the lights on in Metairie, and you see total darkness in New Orleans. So there was nothing. There wasn't a gas station that was open. There wasn't a grocery store that was open. So the lines to go to a grocery store in Metairie were all the way from the cashier all the way to the back. And you would just stand there and make friends with everyone in line. So it was an equalizing kind of time because everyone had a story. And everyone was willing to hear the other person's story. So as you're standing in line with your groceries for 45 minutes to an hour, you just make a new friend. Sitting in line at DMV because we had a car that totally flooded. And so getting a new car and getting a new everything, everybody is in the same boat that you are. So you just kind of suck it up and do it. So the good piece was that I'd taken a sabbatical. So my thought was I would hang out with Mom. Instead I hung out with contractors. And but at least I was here. I don't know how we would have done it if I was still working every day.
Another piece of luck for us. And going back to the darkness, there were no street lights in the city of New Orleans for months after the storm. Not anywhere. And it was probably at least a couple of years before the street lights were in fact all restored. So for the first year after the storm, when it got dark here, it was dark. I mean, literally dark, like you were living out in the middle of nowhere. So it was odd.
Yeah, it sounds unbelievable, but I've heard that from other people, and I saw part of it myself even 2.5 years later. It's like, you gotta be kidding me. But what about the French Quarter? Because we saw, on national news, it was up and running again within weeks after Katrina.
Yeah, we didn't spend a lot of time there. But it was up and running, and it was kind of interesting to see the national perspective of what the quarter, as the quarter represented the city, right? So in a year or two after Katrina, people were being brought into the quarter, and there was some sense that there had been some resolution to everything that had happened. And for months and years, a couple of years after the storm, people would come into the city and they could be downtown and in the French Quarter, in the Central Business District, at hotels, at the convention center. They would have no clue that still 70% of the city was just devastated, just empty. There was nothing there. So it was nice that the quarter survived. I think if the quarter hadn't survived, then I don't know that the city would have, to be quite honest.
And then they did start capitalizing on the fact that people didn't know. And so they started doing devastation tours. And so people that would come in for conferences, it was good that they could then take your Gray Line bus tour around the city and see the Ninth Ward and see different areas and get a sense of how much was still, as Norm said, just devastated. And so I think we continued to get a lot of public funding and people coming in, and they may come in for a conference, but they would spend a day on either end working in the city. And so there was lots of corporate hands and individual hands that really helped, tons of churches that came in to help. So I would say if we were waiting on the government, then we would still be waiting. But the outpouring of support and money and just time was huge. And even with all of that, there's still people that are rebuilding. When I walk the dogs just a block over, finally 9 years later, they were gutting the house a month ago. And like, what were you thinking? And so a lot of people, they just walked away and they didn't want to come back. And they just left the house and yard and everything.
So that's understandable given the amount of work and the economic devastation, and as you've mentioned, there was a lot that Lady Luck shone on you that allowed you to make some of the decisions you did. But so kind of curious, why stay given all of that? I mean, both of you are professionals, both of you have strong earning potential and ability to get a job elsewhere. I know that was an initial, thing, but why did you want to stay in New Orleans?
Well, we may have different reasons for that, but I know my family was pretty stunned that we were staying, and maybe some of Norm's family was pretty stunned and like, why would you do that? And part of it was we did it just because a lot of our friends were not displaced also. Our house was okay. We did have jobs. For me, the thought of leaving, where would we go? You know, do you throw a dart at a map of the United States? I mean, this has been home for such a long time. So our friends were here, our house was here, our jobs were here, my church was here. All of my infrastructure, our infrastructure was here. So in some ways, and we have really good friends. So it's easier to redo sheetrock than it is redo your life. And I really strongly believe that. And I think when I put that in that perspective, then people kind of understand. And we have a lot of very good friends that really did stay. So we kind of have that camaraderie. Had we just moved here and we'd only been here a year and we had no real sense of place, then it might have been somewhat different. So what do you think?
No, I agree. Charlene was actually, I think, between the two of us, she was the one that was adamant when we first had this conversation, are we going or not? Charlene spoke up at a meeting and said, we're not going. This is where our friends are. This is where we're going to stay. And it sounded good to me, so. And again, we were lucky because we both had jobs. And if we had lost our jobs, we probably would have gone on to something else. But we both had jobs that we could stay here in the city with, neither of which were. Charlene was on sabbatical that year, so she had a job that was the best kind of job. She didn't have to go to work, but she knew that when she came off sabbatical, she would have a job. So.
Right. And it also afforded me the time to sit for hours with all of that road home applications and SBA loans and all of that.
So that was another piece of the luck, because she had all that free time. A lot of people just working their way through the bureaucracy. The federal government had provided money for people to stay, but getting through the forms and the bureaucracy of doing it just took an enormous amount of time and persistence. It was easy for people just to give up and say, I'm not doing this, okay, because it's just insane. And it was. But Charlene just kept after it, so.
With that tenacity, we got, thousands of dollars in assistance. So would we have been able to put our house back together if we hadn't gotten it? I don't think so. Because the insurance that was given, like we had kind of said, that everything was so expensive because it's the whole thing of supply and demand. So because everyone, and we were there, it's kind of like whatever we needed, everyone else needed it, because we came in at the very beginning. So everyone was gutting houses at the same time. Then everyone was doing plumbing at the same time. Then everyone was doing electricity at the same time. Everyone wanted kitchen cabinets at the same time. So it was like on and on and on, that whatever our next step was, there was like a line a mile long of everybody else that needed that too. And so it was a seller's market. I mean, so whatever they asked, that was what it was. And it seemed like whatever contractor came by, we would get bids, and they were all like exactly the same. Like, oh my God. So it was a crazy time and a very expensive time. And so you kind of have that sense of, we can have that window or we can have that door. I mean, we can't do both. And so luckily, we did have road home money, and we did have an SBA loan, and we got that and paid that off, and that was huge. So for us to go through it, it was extremely trying in terms of our brain power, our patience, all of that, and we're pretty smart people. So there was a whole lot of New Orleans that really didn't have the transportation and the wherewithal to understand all the forms and ask all the questions, that you can just see why it took so long and people just gave up.
So what is New Orleans like now? And specifically, what is Gentilly Terrace like now? Because you lived here a very long time. What are your perceptions of this area?
Well,
is
so
it the same, different?
No, it's different. It's different in a couple of ways. Most of the houses that are in Gentilly Terrace, which is between us and the top of the ridge, survived, and Some of them, like ours, were gutted and remodeled on the inside. Nothing was done to the outside. So beyond us, away from the ridge, is part of the neighborhood's called the Gardens, Gentilly Gardens. Almost all of it was underwater. A lot of those houses had to be demolished because they couldn't be saved. So there's still a lot of, if you go up into that section of our neighborhood, there's even a lot of empty lots. There are still houses that have never been gutted. They're just closed. 9 years later, they're just closed. So that's one of the differences. And another difference is that we had a large population of elderly before Katrina. This was a neighborhood that was built in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, and so people lived here all their lives, their adult lives. They had grown old in their houses. And so after the storm, the elderly were especially hard hit because they did not have the wherewithal. Even with federal money to help them, even with loans, even with insurance. And, excuse me, many of them didn't have insurance because they didn't have mortgages. They weren't required to have flood insurance because they didn't have mortgages.
And we never flooded.
And we never flooded. So they didn't have the financial resources to rebuild their houses, and they weren't going to borrow money at the age of 70 to do it. That was not reasonable. So they probably wouldn't be able to borrow the money at the age of 70 without an income. So we have lost a large number of elderly. This neighborhood is a lot younger than it used to be, demographically.
I would say all the houses that were rebuilt, they're nicer houses.
Yeah.
Even though it's taking a while, if you go toward the lake, when I walk the dogs in that area, many of the houses have become really cute, nice houses. Many of them still are not. And so you can see there's more of, not a jack-o'-lantern effect because there's still people living in there, but you just see, I don't know what you would call it, but a change in a house that someone has really spent a lot of time in fixing up the outside and probably the inside right next door to somebody who just didn't have the wherewithal to do that and just moved in. And many of the houses are still slab on grade kind of over there. And many of them, they have really built them up. And some of them have built them up very, very high. So I don't know if you have seen that or not, but it's kind of a comical effect where it looks like, a double wide house just on huge stilts. So people are, this ain't happening to me again. But the neighborhood, again, our neighbors came back, so we didn't have a ton of new neighbors that were new, even though we did have some. And we didn't have the amount of FEMA trailers here. Also, we hadn't really talked about FEMA trailers and how that kind of dotted the landscape. That would have been our plight. Had we not had a place to stay, we probably would have had a FEMA trailer pulled up into the driveway. And because there's only 2 humans and 2 dogs, we would have gotten the very smallest FEMA trailer. And all of the stories about all the formaldehyde and all of that stuff and people having, different health problems and brain damage and all that kind of stuff as a result. So that's another huge piece that, again, we were very lucky. I don't know that we could have lived on the property and walked from the driveway to the house every day without having any kind of relief. You were so active in the Gentilly Gardens Neighborhood Association, so you really saw a whole lot of changes in that sense, though.
The neighborhood is, I think, in terms of what kind of neighborhood it is, I don't think Gentilly Terrace is a lot different than it was before the storm, but it is somewhat different because of the loss of elderly. Okay, so the young people that have moved here, I think they're more diverse than the people that used to live here. I think that's certainly true. And we, as a neighborhood, are I think, different in terms of, we had a neighborhood organization that wasn't very active. They were only active for certain reasons, which is typical of neighborhoods, I think. But one of the things that they had done is they had helped create this National Historic District here in Gentilly Terrace. That would have been one of their major accomplishments. And but after the storm, I really pushed the neighborhood organization to be a lot more aggressive about what they did. So for about 2.5 years after the storm, I was president of this neighborhood. And you know, those were trying times because we didn't have any place to meet. We used to meet at the University of New Orleans because it was the only place that had power at night. We could have meetings and have a room that had lights if we went to the university, so that's what we did for a while. But it's a different organization now. The neighborhood organization is just different now. I think a lot better than it used to be. More inclusive, more concerned about a broad spectrum of problems, not just whether or not you live in the historic district, but crime, which we have some, and just how do we take care of our neighborhood and make sure it's a place that we all want to live.
So, just like 2 more questions. So one of the things I just wanted to touch on is something you said about the neighborhood's more diverse.
Mm-hmm.
And could you describe a little bit, clearly younger, but could you describe a little bit more about diversity in New Orleans in general and your thoughts on that now?
Well, so if you look at the city now and in the way that the population has regrown, so by and large, not all the people that lived here before returned. Again, the elderly did not come back. If they survived the storm, they tended to stay away. Just did not have the resources to be here. So the people that have come here in the last 9 years are basically young people, and they might have come here to actually help rebuild the city and fell in love with the city and decided to stay. But we have a big influx of people now because we have all these people that want to be innovative, and the city is doing a lot to encourage those kinds of people, so especially people in the IT industry, to come to the city of New Orleans in various cutting edge industries. So that's where the city is actually growing, these young professionals. So that's true in this neighborhood in some sense. We have a lot more people that are not from here living in this neighborhood than before the storm. And we have a lot more African American people, I would say, that live in this neighborhood than before the storm. Partly because this was a good neighborhood. Again, there was a core of the neighborhood that existed after Katrina where you could come and people were living here. So if they had the wherewithal to buy a house in this neighborhood, it was a good place to be. New Orleans East, where a lot of middle-class African American people live, was totally destroyed by the storm. So, and those people didn't want to go back there. They wanted to go to some place that seemed safer to them, and Gentilly Terrace was one of those places that seemed safer to them. So,
So maybe you can speak to, if you're more aware maybe of the influx of just more of the Hispanic community.
So after the storm, we had a large demand for cheap labor, okay, and through processes that you all know, because we don't seem to control our borders, lots of people came here from Mexico that were undocumented workers. Thousands of them came here after the storm, and they were able to make some money and send that money back home, by and large. I think that's what they did. And they stayed, and thousands of them are still here. So it is just the next wave in Hispanic migration, which has been going on in New Orleans for a long, long time. In the late 1950s, it was Cubanos who came here because of the fall of Cuba. In the 1980s, it was Hondurans who came here because of the devastation of a hurricane in Honduras. In Katrina, it was Mexicans. We've had one kind of cycle of Hispanic community after another. And so the city is a lot more Hispanic than it used to be, or in recent terms.
And there's been talk shows and all that's a really good thing, and probably 50 years from now there'll be, the whole food will have merged and incorporated so many of the different spices and ways of cooking, from the Hispanic culture, and music will take on a whole new shift. And so we have many more people, I think, in the workplace that are Hispanic, and people in our neighborhood that are Hispanic. And they also have said that New Orleans could not have rebuilt had it not been for all of the people from Mexico and other countries that came up. We did not have the people power to do that. We needed unskilled labor and very kind of minor skilled labor to do all of the work that was needed. And we couldn't have done it. And even in the restaurant and for all the conventions and everything, so many of the people that were doing those jobs, from being waiters to service people to dishwashers to maids to everything, all of those people left. And they had no reason to come back because they were renting here and their houses were gone. So those were all the people that were maybe in the Superdome or Convention Center, or then got bused to Texas or Atlanta or someplace, and they are still gone for the most part. So they needed a whole lot of people to come in and take those jobs. So even if the cook came back, the chef came back, they had nobody else to be there. And so we came back a lot because of Mexico. Yeah.
That's ironic, and I'm not going to push on that too much, but one last question. Do we have time?
Yeah, you got about a little over 4 minutes on this card. So
A quick question.
So, what do you want, if you had your druthers of what you would want people outside of New Orleans to think about New Orleans, what would you want them to think? What would you want them to know?
Well, I would like them to know that we've come a long way since the storm, a really long way. We still have a ways to go. There's a large portion of the city that's still devastated and empty. And I would only couch that with these words. There are parts of the city that probably don't need to grow back the way they were before the storm. But the city is coming back, and it's going to be different in good ways, and it's going to be very similar to what it was before Katrina in good ways. And you know, I just know from dealing with industry that it's easy for people to fall in love with the city of New Orleans. And so that's the sort of thing that still exists here. The things that people fell in love with before are still here. And then there are large parts of the city, both in terms of infrastructure and in terms of politics, in terms of the way we do things from a bureaucratic point of view, that are just better now than they were before the storm. So it's in many ways, it's a better place to be.
And I think it's gotten some exposure for a lot of the people that came in to help. As Norm said, that they stayed. And so we just have, I think there's a lot more ambassadors out there that are saying how wonderful New Orleans is. And it is. I'm very glad that we moved here those many years ago and that we have stayed. You know, I love living here. And I think all of our friends really feel the same. And it's been a good choice.
Yes, it has.